We're in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. What a wonderful text. For a couple of reasons. Personally, I love the story of Joseph. Anybody else in the room? Some of my earliest memories of grade school was my teacher, Mrs. Walls, when we'd come in from recess, reading from Genesis to us. Yeah, that was back in the day, I know. And I remember falling to sleep with my head on the desk after recess, listening to the words of Joseph's story. And since then, I suspect, I don't know how many times in my ministry that I've preached through the life of Joseph, because it's always fascinated me. Well, today, we're going to be looking at one verse here. So I'm excited, if for no other reason, it's Joseph, one of my very favorite Bible characters. But a second reason is it adds such depth and understanding to our But God series. Let me read the text and then I'll comment on what I mean by that. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. I'm looking forward to telling you this story. And if you're familiar with it, can you enter into the innocence of that grade school child that I just talked about and listen to it all again as if for the first time? And if you're not familiar with it, boy, do we have a treat for you. This is a magnificent story. But the comment I wanted to make about the importance of this particular text in this greater series, as we're looking at how God steps in and intervenes in our lives. And we've looked at so many ways that he does that. And I was thinking, I wonder if we're thinking of God like a superhero. You know, in this sermon series, that he's flying overhead and he's seeing a problem, he swoops in, he solves the problem, everyone is grateful, and there he's gone. Then he's gone. You know, I wonder if any of us have been thinking in that kind of a way, not because the Bible would ever train us to think of God that way, but because maybe Hollywood would. You know that so many of the redemption stories and the storylines that you see in Hollywood really are lifted from the Scripture. The plots, at least. But that would be an inadequate understanding of these but God texts. He's not simply observing what we're doing and swooping in to rescue us when we cannot rescue ourselves. There is never a moment in your life that God is not there in the midst of it. And Joseph teaches us that in this text. It's not just a struggle of good versus evil, where there's this tug of war with our soul, where Satan and God are in this battle, and for one moment it feels like one is winning and the other. Speaking of biblical misconceptions, let's just talk about that one for a moment. Satan is not a fallen God. He is a fallen angel. Okay? Let's just establish that. He's an angel that couldn't make the cut. Apparently, Clarence did, but Satan didn't. It is a wonderful life, isn't it? He was booted out. He's just a bad angel. Now, I'm not saying that to diminish the work of what Satan does. He is alive and he is well, and he is not to be underestimated. But he is not God's peer. God has no peers. And so it's not this tug of war battle going on. It's not good versus evil, because what we learn in this text is God can even use evil, that which is intended for evil, for His good purposes. So if there's been a moment this week, this month, this year, that you felt alone, that you felt abandoned, that whether you said it or not, you thought it, God, where are you? Then please lean in. Well, you meant it for evil against me. Joseph, of course, is talking to his brothers. You meant to do evil. Well, what evil is he referring to? Well, when Joseph was a young man, his father sent him out to check on his older brothers, who did not live the easy life that Joseph lived, the cushioned, the privileged life. He sent him out to check on his brothers and tell Daddy whether or not they're doing well or not. Now, some of that could be just a wellness check. Is everybody okay? Did anybody hurt themselves? But I suspect that some of it was, any little brothers in the room, or anyone known for being a tattletale when you were younger? I suspect that I'm the third son. Perhaps some of that was at play too. So he goes out to check them. They're supposed to be tending the flocks near Shechem. The brothers saw him coming, this dreamer who had the audacity to wear his best clothes out in the field. Can you imagine how privileged a life he lived? That he would wear his coat of honor out into the fields. And they took that coat off of his back, his garment of favoritism. They threw him into a pit and intended to kill him. But one of his brothers says, "No, why would we kill him? He's our brother. Let's sell him into slavery. You know, he's our brother after all. Let's make a little bit off of him." And then they took that garment and dipped it in goat's blood and presented it to their father. Can you imagine? That's evil. It's evil to abuse their brother like that. It's evil to sell him. And then to their own father. That's evil. All of this started like an evil chain reaction for Joseph. So now here he is, stripped of his favoritism, headed to Egypt, a new land, a new language, new customs, new people, no longer having Daddy looking after him and giving him special portions and special treatment. Now he's a slave. He had nothing. Oh, that's not true. God was with him. And if you're going to be a slave, well, he landed a pretty good job. He was looking after Potiphar's household. And he was good at what he did. You know, he was just one of those guys that whatever he touched turned to gold. Had that Midas touch, so to speak. presence of God was there among him. And he rose in authority in Potiphar's household to where there was nothing in his home, in Potiphar's home, that wasn't available to Joseph. He was running the house and had the privileges of the house, everything, well, except, of course, his wife. But his wife and Potiphar had a disagreement about even that. And so Joseph and I apparently have a lot in common. He was very handsome. He was very young. And Potiphar's wife had eyes for him and soon had hands for him. And Potiphar could not do this, Joseph could not do this evil against his boss or against his God. He said no. And that just made her intensify the effort so that she threw herself at him. And she grabbed onto his garment, and he slipped out of that garment and ran away. You remember last week we talked about how God gives us a way of escape. There's never a temptation that you will experience that is not common to everyone. In fact, there is never a temptation that you've experienced that Jesus himself has not experienced. Now, the difference is he has withstood those temptations without sin, and all of us, of course, it's well known that all of us are sinful. But he did exactly what Paul would later tell us to do. Run. Run. We do not play chicken with temptation. Remember, we learned that last week. We pray for one another. We remember that Jesus has experienced everything we have, that he's on our side, he's providing for us. And we collaborate with him in the way of escape that he has provided. For Joseph, it meant he ran, leaving behind what would then become the garment of accusation. She turned, she flipped the story completely when she spoke to her husband. Of course she did. Of course she did. And now Joseph is thrown into another pit of sorts. This time it had bars. It was a prison. And what happened to Joseph while he's in that prison? Well, he finds favor once again. See, every time we see Joseph, he's leaving behind a garment. The garment of favoritism is gone. The garment of accusation now is gone. He has nothing except his integrity. And you know, when you think about it, if your integrity is lost, everything is lost. It doesn't matter what else you have. Everything else is gone. But Joseph maintained his integrity. And of course, it wasn't just his integrity he had with him. Because God is not a superhero. He doesn't wear a white hat, and he doesn't come in riding on a white horse. He doesn't leave us alone and then just in the nick of time come in and rescue us. Leave us in a safe place and go. You see, when Joseph was in the pit, God was there. When Joseph was enslaved, God was there. When Joseph was in prison, God was there. So he found favor with the jailer and with some fellow prisoners. there were some fellow prisoners that were having some troubling dreams. And remember that in the ancient Near East, dreams were thought to be a way that God spoke to people. I suppose that still happens today in that culture and frankly in ours too. God speaks to us in many ways if we'll just clean out the earwax and listen. Sometimes He speaks to us through other people. All the time He speaks to us through the Word. Have you ever been quiet long enough to hear the still small voice of God? And sometimes He even speaks to us in the dreams. Well, these two men had troubling dreams, and Joseph understood that God was the author and the interpreter of those dreams, and he gave them the interpretation. Now, for one of them, it was very good news. For one of them, it was very bad news. But in both instances, it was an accurate and a correct interpretation. And so the cupbearer who received the good news, and remember that the cupbearer is in a position of advising to the Pharaoh. He is the chief safety officer. And so this is not, don't think long apron, a napkin on the arm and a butlerish kind of no. This is a man's man that is there to ensure the safety of Pharaoh. And he had promised Joseph that he would remember him, but he was a man and he tended to forget, and he did forget until he remembered 2 years later when Pharaoh was having a troubling dream. And he remembered about Joseph. Okay, what would it be like to be in that pit? What would it be like to be in that prison cell? And then what would it be like to think you're about to get out of that prison cell and 2 years drag on? I have a little coat rack right outside of my office where I attempted to do wood carving. I'm not a wood carver, and you can look at this piece sometime when you come over, and you'll see it's very rustic, but what I carved into the wood above that coat rack are these words, in His time. Because every time I walk into my home office to work, I want to be reminded, impatient me, that God does His work, but He does it in His time. So for 2 years, He sat alone. Do I have to keep correcting myself, or are you going to help me and correct me? He was not alone, was He? No. He was not alone because God was with him. And then the call came. And Pharaoh told Joseph about his dream, and Joseph interpreted the dream, and then he did what I consider stepping over the line. He told the Pharaoh, a prisoner one day, an advisor to Pharaoh the next. He told Pharaoh what he needs to do. He needs to get him a sharp cookie that can administer these 7 years of plenty that are coming, that will be followed by 7 years of famine. He needs a sharp cookie that can administer that so that when the skinny cows are eating the fat cows, when famine has taken over, that there's bread. There's bread in the house of Egypt. And so life is progressing just like what Joseph predicted. The Pharaoh did find a wise person, right? It was Joseph. And so he went from his prison garbs to now wearing this garment of exaltation. And on his hand was the signet ring of Pharaoh. He had full authority. Everyone was now to do whatever he said to do. And by everyone, I mean Potiphar and Potiphar's wives and the jailer. I mean everyone. Joseph is large and in charge. And you guys aren't going to correct me. Well, I think God is still on the throne. And even in his favored position, God is in charge. And Joseph is not missing that, not even for a minute. So for 9 years in this position of power, this 9 years after that he ascended to this position of power, our story takes a twist. 10 of Joseph's brothers, the very brothers that threw him into the pit, that sold him into slavery, have come hungry, needing to buy grain for his family. Joseph recognized them, but they didn't recognize him at all. So Joseph immediately accused them of spying, and he threw them into prison for 3 days. So what's going on in the text at this point? Is Joseph getting even? Is this his pound of flesh? Is Joseph seizing an opportunity to put his brothers under his powerful thumb? Well, here they are for 3 days, a complete amount of time. And he wasn't getting even. 3 days later, he released all of them, and he gave them the grain that they requested, and even returned the money to them. But they also knew that he meant business. Now, 3 days is not the same as the years that he had spent there, but I imagine any time in jail is significant. So they've got the grain, their money is returned inside. However, Joseph, he wanted to make sure that they would return. And so he kept one of the brothers in jail to ensure they would return with Benjamin, his younger brother that had the same mother. And to make sure that they would return, he kept one of them. I guess it was kind of like a pawn, you know. I guess he pawned one. They had to pawn one of their brothers, and left him behind, and they could go back. Well, when they returned home, Israel refused to let Benjamin go back, and then he says this. What must have been one of the most horrible things to ever hear your father say. He said, his brother is dead and he's the only one I have left. Wow. Most of us have daddy issues, but come on. I mean, that is huge. Can you imagine hearing those words? He says, no, you can't take Benjamin back to prove that the story is right. He held firm up until the time they ran out of food. And then he realized that he didn't have a choice. One of the brothers promised, if you'll let me take him, If he doesn't come back, you can kill one of my sons, right? Judah steps in and convinces him that he'll watch over him. And sure enough, Israel, now an aged man, lets his favorite son now go with the brothers back to Egypt. And so when Joseph sees them all, he prepares a great feast for them. And he gives Benjamin much more than the other brothers. The favoritism, the family favoritism is continuing. And they feast. And then Joseph sends them home, again, with the grain that they needed, all the money that they had paid, plus one more thing. His special cup is placed in Benjamin's bag. After they left, Joseph then reveals that his cup is missing. And he sent his men to go and to find those Israelites that had been there, and to search through their things, and then to bring it back, to bring the cup back and all of them. And so they do that, and they find the cup in Benjamin's bag. And so now we have the showdown. Joseph has them right where he wanted them. Now his plan was to throw Benjamin in jail so then that his father would come and he would get to see his father before he died. His plan, his scheme, maybe is a better word, was he wanted to see his dad again. Remember, he hadn't seen him since he was a young man, since he was a precocious, spoiled, is that fair enough? Child. And now he was a man of integrity and a man of God. I suspect he didn't just want to see his father, but he wanted his father to see him. That was his plan. Joseph would have no idea what was about to happen. So he tells them what they have to do. Benjamin is going into jail. You go back. You've lied to me. You bring your father back here. Then I'll believe you. You have to do this. There's no other way. And then he hears them speaking in their own language. And of course, they have no idea their brother can understand what they're saying. And we get a glimpse into their view of who God is. They said, God is punishing us for the evil that we've done to our brother. Joseph breaks down and cries. Judah makes an impassioned plea. Now, I need you to remember who it is that made the plea. It's going to be important here in a minute. Judah made an impassioned plea to let his brother go and take him instead. He doesn't want to see his father grieved by the loss of his favorite son, Benjamin. And he offers his own life. If you're counting in the narrative, I don't think I've drawn attention to all of them, sorry about that. But if you're counting in the narrative, this is now the third time that Joseph breaks down and cries. And it's in front of his brothers. The first time he cried, he was when his brothers had lamented what they had done to him. He was overcome with emotion, and he went into a private chamber to weep. The second time, Joseph cried just in seeing his younger brother Benjamin. And now the third time. He sent his attendants from the room, but he wept so loud that everyone heard his tears and what he said. He revealed himself to them. He reminded them that he was their brother. And he gave them all the wagons they needed to take the food and the garments on their back. These garments of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of where he says to them, I'm forgiving you. Go and bring my father back to me so that you and he can avoid the years of famine that are to come. The brothers did exactly what Joseph said, and Joseph and his father were reunited by Genesis chapter 46. And Israel had the privilege of living next to all of his children before he died a few years later. He asked his children to bury him next to Leah in the ancestral tomb, and they did that. But when they returned, the brothers are paranoid. They had seen Joseph forgive, at least they had heard it, and they had seen the fruit of that forgiveness. But now that Dad was gone, was Joseph just doing this for his sake? And now that Dad was gone, what was going to happen? That's when Joseph said the words in our text today. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And then he explains it to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. You know, I think there are a few people in the world that have suffered more injustice than Joseph did. But he chose not to be bitter. He chose not to be angry at God, because he understood at every one of these low points and high points of his life. And by the way, I didn't say this a minute ago, but let me stress it now. Good times and prosperity and health could be among the greatest trials we face. Are we faithful then? See, most people, when they're against the corner, when they're up against it, will cry out to God for help. But do we understand that in every moment of our life we need him? Like the old hymn said, we need thee every hour. Every hour. And Joseph is saying that God intended this evil to be good. And he made it good. Genesis 45:7 says, God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Amazing. He understood that part of God's great purposes could involve his own pain. And suffering was collateral damage of God's good purpose in providing for His people. And if you think by providing for His people that I just mean that there was food for them to eat, oh, it was so much more. Do you remember a name I asked you to remember? Judah, do you remember that name? Judah says, "Take my life, set him free." If you go to Matthew and read in the genealogy of Jesus, you will see Judah's name there. You do know that Jesus descended from the tribe of Judah. That if Joseph would have exacted revenge and taken him up on that offer, would have thwarted the great purposes of God. Well, God would have found another way. We know that. But at least on the surface. Now here's where I really want you to lean in, and I have another word for you at the end of the message. In the difficult days, in the hard days, in the midst of the struggle, you don't need to cry out and invite God into your suffering and your pain. He's already there. And more than that, He is working out His good purposes in the midst of all of that. For Joseph, it was neon sign bright. It was that Jesus would be born and make a way possible for all who believe. For those of you that are on the beginning of your faith journey, let me spend just a little bit of time talking about the difference that Christ can make in your life. And for those of you that are further along, at the end of the message, then I want to close with an exhortation to you. You know, there's a lot of ways that we're different. We're different in our personalities. In fact, all of our fingerprints are different. Our DNA is different. Certainly we have similarities, but nothing is carbon copy exact. There's only one way that I know that we are all the same, and that is that all of us have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Now, I do understand that some people have sinned more than other people, and that when you compare yourself to others, you may say, well, I haven't sinned more than that person. Well, okay, I'll give you that. Though I would remind you that pride itself is a sin, and probably self-righteousness is a pretty big one, but for the sake of being agreeable with you, okay. But the standard isn't to sin less, it's to be sinless. And we've all fallen short of the glory of God. And that sin has a wage. The Scripture says that the wages of sin is death. Just as there is physical death that comes after physical birth, there is also a spiritual death that comes. And because of that wage, that spiritual death, it becomes this eternal separation from God and God's favor among us. But then there's that great but God passage. But God showed His love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. There's hope. There's hope for me. There's hope for you. Not because we are sinless, but because Christ has paid the price for our sin. And He has said in His Word, in Romans 10:9 and 10, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God has raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the mouth one believes and is justified. with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. And so, friends, do you believe that Jesus died on the cross and that He rose from the dead? If you do, is there any good reason why you cannot confess Him as your Lord right now? Experience that forgiveness that's made possible because of what He's done. Today, everything can change for you. Today you can experience that forgiveness that Christ has made possible for us on the cross.